Good afternoon and welcome to yet another episode of The League, a Biblical Enthusiast. Now last week we finished our two-part series on the Revised Standard Version and those two major controversies that followed. Today we move to an entirely new single-author translation of the Bible, specifically the New Testament, someone you may have never heard of. His name is Richmond Lattimore. Who is Richmond Lattimore? When did he complete his translation? Was he qualified to do so? And what was his translation philosophy? We'll answer these questions and look at some familiar passages to get a feel for what his translation is like in comparison to others. So hang on to your hats as we look further into Richard Lattimore's New Testament, along with the ever curious, ever faithful League of Biblical Enthusiasts. His full name is Richmond Alexander Lattimore, and was born May 6, 1906, and died February 26, 1984. He was an American poet and classicist known for his translations of the Greek classics, especially his versions of the Iliad and the Odyssey. He was born of Quaker parents in Pao-Ting-Fu, China, was educated at home by his father until they moved to the United States, and he attended high school in Berkeley, California. Lattimore graduated from Dartmouth College in 1926, and as a Rhodes Scholar in 1929, he studied at Christ Church, Oxford, and later held a fellowship at the American Academy in Rome. In 1935, he received his doctorate from the University of Illinois, and it was completed by his dissertation on Greek and Egyptian epitaphs. While lecturing at various universities, his home base became Bryn Mawr College in Pennsylvania, where, as Paul Shorey Professor of Greek, he remained until his retirement in 1971. He married Alice Bachstaller, with whom he later had two sons. Over the course of his academic career, he was a visiting lecturer at the University of Chicago, Columbia University, Johns Hopkins, the University of London, the University of Toronto, and at UCLA. He was widely honored as a scholar, a poet, and translator of Greek literature. He was also a recipient of a Rockefeller Post-War Fellowship in 1946 and a Fulbright Research Fellowship for study in Greece. Lattimore was a member of Phi Beta Kappa, National Institute of Arts and Letters, American Academy of Arts and Sciences, the American Philosophical Society, the American Philological Association, and the Archaeological Institute of America. In addition, he was a fellow at the American Academy of Rome and an honorary student at Christ Church, Oxford. Let's just sum it up and say he had an amazing academic career with many awards. His many translations of ancient Greek and Latin poetry and plays are often used as standard translations today. In the Iliad of Homer, 1951, and the Odyssey of Homer in 1969, Lattimore used a less colloquial translation than those that were current. He's also well known for his translations of the Odes of Pindar and Aristophanes' The Frogs, which won the Theologian Translation Prize. And along with David Green, he edited the translation series, The Complete Greek Tragedies. Now, most relevant to our episode today is his translation of the New Testament, released in several volumes over time. His first attempt was in the Book of Revelation in 1962, which found its way into his Four Gospels and the Revelation in 1979. followed later by his translation of Acts and the Letters of the Apostles, 1982. And a complete volume of his New Testament was published posthumously in 1996. Now, he did not translate the New Testament as a theologian, or even as a pastor, or as a minister, or even as a Christian. He came at it strictly from the point of view as a classicist. However, for many years, Lattimore accompanied his wife Alice to church services at the Episcopal Church of the Good Shepherd in Rosemont near Bryn Mawr College. And he said that regarding his translation, there was one evangelist he preferred for his elegant Greek. And while recovering in the hospital from surgery, Lattimore admitted that his doubts about the faith had disappeared somewhere in St. Luke. Soon after, he announced he'd be baptized on Easter Eve, and at the public baptism, with closed eyes and head uplifted, Dick, as he was known, solemnly recited the creed in Greek. He instructed that at his funeral, this story be told to all of his academic colleagues. It was said of him that, active as he was with teaching and writing and research, he still had time for people and was the kindest, most considerate, and gentlest of men. He died of cancer at age 77 in Rosemont, Pennsylvania, his home of many years. I think the summary that we've given should answer most of the questions that we provided at the outset. In particular, he was most certainly qualified to translate the Greek New Testament. And as far as his translation approach, he favored an essentially literal approach. And he said this in his preface to the four Gospels and Revelation. I have held throughout to the principle of keeping as close to the Greek as possible, not only for sense and individual words, but in the belief that fidelity to the original word order and syntax may yield an English prose that to some extent reflects the style of the original. And he continued, it will follow, or should, that since each of the Gospels and Revelation is the work of a different author with a different style, they should read differently in English. And my aim has been to let all of my texts translate themselves with as little interference as possible. So this literal approach puts his work in the same category as the King James Version, the Revised Standard Version, English Standard Version, and others that follow the essentially literal approach. He wrote that he used Westcott and Hort's The New Testament Greek 1957 edition as his base Greek text. He noted also that he consulted the Pelican Gospel commentaries as well as Arndt and Grinch Greek-English lexicon, presumably as a guide to difficult issues. With this short summary behind us, let's look at his New Testament. First, I will note that he begins the New Testament with the Gospel of Mark, because he held to the consensus that still exists today that Mark was the first gospel written. And then, of course, in his New Testament, Matthew, Luke, and John follow. There are no chapter or verse divisions in his text. And if you're not used to that, it can be a little jarring, because if you want to go back and find a particular passage, you'll have to skim through and pick it out yourself. But it makes an interesting way to read the New Testament. As you are aware, the original Greek language had no chapter divisions, no verse divisions. These were all introduced much later into English. He also uses a paragraph mark to indicate changes of thought. This is one of the breaks, if any, that he uses in the text. There are no red letters for the words of Jesus. There are few italics or bolding of words. He did italicize Jesus' cry on the cross in Matthew 27, Eli, Eli, lama sabachthani. He provided a set of translation notes at the end of the book to indicate reasons for certain translation choices. There are no footnotes. There are no endnotes within the text to reference those notes. So you are reliant on viewing the notes yourself and doing your best to find that relevant passage to which it refers. Now let's turn to some familiar passages to get a sense of how he translates compared to other popular versions. Let's look at the ever familiar Beatitudes of Matthew chapter 5, and here is his rendering. And seeing the multitudes, he went up onto the mountain. And when he was seated, his disciples came to him, and he opened his mouth and taught them, saying, Blessed are the poor in spirit, because theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are they who sorrow, because they shall be comforted. Blessed are the gentle, because they shall inherit the earth. Blessed are they who are hungry and thirsty for righteousness, for they shall be fed. Blessed are they who have pity, because they shall be pitied. Blessed are the pure in heart, because they shall see God. Blessed are the peacemakers, because they shall be called the sons of God. Now, if this sounds familiar, it's very straightforward and very simple, with a view for word rendering. Then we're on the same page, pardon the pun. If you didn't know what you were reading, you might think it was the King James Version. And so far, so good, a very conservative approach. In a nod to archaic language of the King James Version, Lattimore in Mark 6 has the daughter Herodias saying to Herod, I wish you to give forthwith the head of John the Baptist. Likewise, in Matthew 19, he has Jesus say, and I tell you that he who divorces his wife except for harlotry, not the modern word divorce. And in Matthew 6:24, Jesus says you cannot serve God and mammon. Now, in a footnote, Lattimore understands that the word means money, but leaves me wondering why he did not just translate it money. Well, that's because he's bound himself to a literal interpretation of the words, and the Greek word in the passage has mammon. So that settles it. In Matthew chapter 2, verse 1, he refers to the astrologers who visit the baby Jesus as Magians. Hopefully, this is not to be confused with modern-day MAGA enthusiasts. However, his penchant for literal renderings is not always consistent. As we've noted in an earlier episode that we entitled, Are Literal Translations Always Literal? And the answer is no, they're not. And it's very difficult to be consistent. In Matthew 19, in the discussion on marriage and divorce, Jesus notes that not all can accept his teaching. And Jesus says, in Lattimore's translation, For there are sexless men who have been so from their mother's womb, and there are sexless men who have been made sexless by other men, and there are sexless men who have made themselves sexless for the sake of the kingdom of heaven. Now, the phrase sexless men in Greek is eunuchoi, and many translations have eunuchs. So why not Lattimore? Good question. In Acts chapter 2, verse 17, Peter quotes Joel on the day of Pentecost with these words, But this is what was spoken of by the prophet Joel. And it will come about in the final days, says God, that I will inspire all flesh with my spirit. The Greek word is ekeo, and usually translated pour out. But Lattimore translates it as inspire, and it has some merit, and it makes for a thoughtful rendering. Here is his rendering of Hebrews chapter 1 in the first few verses. God, who in ancient times spoke to our fathers in many and various ways through the prophets, has now in these last days spoken to us through his Son, whom he made the heir to all things, and through whom he also created the ages. He is the gleam of his glory and the representation of his nature. He carries all things by the word of his power, and when he had caused purifications from sins, he took his seat on the right hand of the majesty in the highest, thus proving to be greater than the angels by as much as the name he inherited is more exalted than theirs. Well, I'm almost sorry to say this, but on the whole, there's not much originality in Lattimore's translation. But perhaps that's a good thing. Maybe Bible translations today are striving for too much creativity rather than fidelity. Lattimore's text is similar to the King James due to it being an essentially literal translation. One reads much like the other. All in all, it's a good rendering. Nothing to write home about, no major controversies, no flash and bang idiosyncrasies, just simple and honest translation work. Well, thank you for sticking with us these 15 to 20 minutes or so. And please, if you like what you hear, please like and subscribe and share this channel with your friends. I hope you have found this episode informative. We aim to educate on all things biblical, Old and New Testaments, history of interpretation, archaeology, and the Bible, translations and translators, significant personalities in the history of the Bible, manuscript hunters, and much, much more. So stay tuned for next week's episode featuring the League of Biblical Enthusiasts.